fitting into those markets and why there's like a phenomenon, there's like a thing where small towns really, when they either have like economic troubles, like unemployment, or if they have certain bad reputations, they try to bring in a prison, which is kind of counterintuitive, just to kind of stimulate the local economy. And that versus there's a national decarceration movement that seems to take more popularity in like big cities like Chicago. And so I guess my
sorry, what's the movement?
It's the smart decarceration movement. I think Professor
Smart decarceration, which means what?
Generally it moves towards trying to either lower the number of open prisons. Also, I think includes some level of reforms in terms of sentencing and the number of inmates, and also including rehabilitation in order to decrease numbers of people that are in prison or how long their sentences are. And so my question, I just had...
People with coughs, we request you watch on YouTube. Active coughing, please leave, okay? Apologies, but we've had, now, is it allergies? If it's only allergies, fine. But if it might be contagious, please.
It's allergies.
Okay, it's allergies. You're 100% sure? Okay, wonderful. Cough all you like. Okay, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, so I guess just my question was, since this is an urban policy class, so a lot of our readings have focused around a lot of different cities, I was wondering if you had some recommendations for resources that focused a little bit more on rural towns, even comparative pieces even, that could be helpful.
Okay, well you got 2 or 3 big overlapping themes. One is sort of small towns versus other places. One is less fortunate economically, less developed places, and might they do, pursue different policies for which are bad for them more generally, or whatever. Third is crime, strictness of, harshness of sentencing, and how crime is handled more generally. And there are 3 literature. These are 3 disparate literatures in a sense. Just briefly on the third, we had several discussions of this and we got two now active faculty in sociology. Robert Vargas has just joined the department, and he's got some very intriguing stuff which he's doing. And Forrest Stewart has worked on homeless and crime issues in LA and now more generally in Chicago, especially with gangs. And then we've had people who come from other places, so job interviews, etc. So there's and Antoine Jones was a teaching assistant with me for a couple of sessions, and he's worked a lot on crime. So we had several sessions on it. That is one big issue which you all ought to know about, and so then we can be cautious about evaluation, but to try to get some simple factual questions. Has crime gone up or down in the last, say, 20, let's say, we can talk 50 years and then maybe 10 to 20 years in the U.S. What have the crime rates been, let's say, over the last 40, 50 years, and then more or less up to present? Yeah, have any clue of that? Is just everybody ought to sort of know these basic facts.
In terms of like convicted crimes, because of the war on drugs during like the late 70s and the 80s, you saw like a marked increase on people convicted of crime, especially because there are a lot of different.
They're on the podium.
Sure, we use supposed to use magic markers. I guess not. Okay, so sorry. Go ahead.
No, I know in Chicago itself.
So let's try to get an approximate line. What might it look like? So maybe 1960s to today. What to say? Conviction, let's say number of arrests, numbers of murders, number of, and then if you want to separate out drug related, we can do that. But let's. Do you folks have more specifics that you?
I feel like it's all just decreasing.
No, but wait, but she's asking the question. If you have a pretty clear answer in your mind, or you've looked at this, fine. If you don't know, say you don't know and you'd like help from others.
Yeah, I know some. I don't remember exactly. Like maybe between 60s and 70s, it might have been kind of stagnant. I know in the 80s to like early 90s, it had created like a large increase. I think it's generally been on the decrease, although in terms of like within certain demographics, like the number may have increased, or in certain cities. So like in Chicago, I know at least this summer when I came into school, I'm a third year. The homicide rate jumped up, I think, to 14%, something around that.
In Chicago.
In Chicago, at least specifically.
Yeah, but it stands out because Chicago is such an exception.
Yeah.
Okay, you two others want to add something?
I mean, I think she was.
Maybe ladies first.
Yeah. Well, I guess I don't know. I only know since the 1960s. Since like the 90s, it's definitely
No,
decreased.
that's fine. So 60s on is what we're asking.
I think it went up a little bit, probably, and then it went down. Like went up a little bit after the 60s, and then went down a little, went down
Okay.
today.
It's probably something like that. Then, but if we get to individual cities, Chicago has gone way up. I mean that may be too much, but New York and LA have gone down. Big competitors. Okay, so we could try to put in drugs separately. I mean the simple drug issue is that the national government said courts and judges in cities are too lenient on drugs, and we want a national policy of forced standardized jail for anybody involved, especially with selling drugs. Okay, so that was, and I can't give you a date on that, but it was back here somewhere. So that led to an increase in drug prison sentencing, but the more general point. I'm sorry, so I think if we go back here, it was lower. So we've got these are approximate. So that's sorry. Do you have an addition to this?
Yeah, but what about like quality of life crimes just inflating the arrest rate?
Tell us what you mean
So
by
like broken windows, like crime, like laws. So like jumping like the turnstile.
Most of these numbers are homicides. I mean, they're usually not broken windows. These are usually more serious crimes. Okay, follow? Yeah.
But going along with that, I know that a lot of people in the African American community have been arrested for drugs, whereas like white people haven't. And I wonder how that might impact the research at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, we're getting to a second certain. So we've got arrests, we've got sentencing, then we've got the concept of surveillance. Then we can add differential, how this affects different neighborhoods. But something which has become much more visible in the last 10 or so years in research and in the policies, especially related to Bratton. Who knows about one guy who really made a difference in this? Who's Bratton? Yes.
He was the NYPD commissioner under Giuliani and de Blasio.
Okay. So Bratton was the police chief in Boston. James Q. Wilson, political scientist from Chicago, developed the so-called broken windows theory, which said that crime will be worse if you have broken windows in a neighborhood, loitering, broken glass, and the image of disrepair will encourage more crime. And so stop the broken windows, stop the loitering, and be strict on small things which may look like they're not important, but they change the feel. Okay, so Bratton heard about this. Wilson was then his professor at Harvard. He implemented it in Boston. The crime rate went way down in Boston. Bratton got a national reputation. He was hired by New York. He stayed in New York, and the crime went down dramatically. The New York style of Bratton as the cop and the mayor were be tough on criminals, and including distinctly, of course, young black men who were more frequently in New York, the term was stop and frisk. That is, there was a big increase in stopping people who were loitering near subway station entrances or at, you know, begging or, you know, panhandling at stop signs and so forth. And those people got stopped, or more frequently stopped, frisked, and then checked for their background. Okay, this led to the second important piece of this. Like I said, just to finish with Bratton. So Bratton went to LA, did the same basic thing in LA. Forrest Stewart did a great study of a neighborhood he was studying before Bratton arrived, and there were hundreds of people in 4 or 5 blocks. It's the main homeless area of LA, and there were lots of prostitutes, drug people, people just loitering, people drinking, people talking, and so forth. Bratton arrived. The police arrived. The police would come to this neighborhood maybe 6 times a day, and they would stop every single person and ask them for their identification. What are you doing here? And after 2 or 3 days, the crowds disappeared, because many of the people, and so Forrest he did maybe 4 or 5 years of detailed field work in this one neighborhood. He had a clear sense of a lot. He also rode around with the cops. He talked to the cops. Got a feel of how it was working. And so what came out of this is the idea, not just of crime and arrests and going to jail, but the sense of surveillance, stopping and frisking, the fear of people to be stopped or interrogated by the police, because many of them might have a small offense on a police record from 5 or 10, for something relatively minor, or they may be drug dealers who have been convicted in the past, in which case if they have a 3rd offense, they may have a serious jail sentence imposed. So the general point, and so we have some numbers which are, and we have some national numbers, some national data, as well as these case studies. We put these together, and there is a big increase. So this is the Bratton era, if you will, the sort of being more tough, and so if we get quickly to evaluations, people will say clearly there's a conflict between being tougher and human rights, personal sensitivity, trying to restore people who have deviated at a young age. They've been around kids in school. They have models, etc. I mean, so clearly that this has been here for hundreds of years of how to whether to be tougher or not, and how to do it. So without trying to get and we can explore that if you want. I mean, there are clear religious differences, there are regional differences, there are international differences, etc. Conceptions of individual responsibility and so forth, which Max Weber and others have written about. But my quick point was, we have whether you say it's good or bad, the Bratton type policies were followed initially in those 3 cities, let's say those 2 cities, New York and LA, not Chicago. And crime measured by arrests, sentencing, a series of things, dramatically decreased, like dropping by half in over roughly a 10-year period. Okay. Bratton took credit for it. The mayors of New York and LA said this is working, this is successful. The critics said you were racist, you're classist, you're being too tough on minorities, etc. And there were certainly elements of truth in all of this. But I mean, what I want to point out as background, whether you say it's good or bad, or we should do more or less, or how it should be changed, there was a dramatic drop in the number the jails are empty. I won't say empty. The jails are, back here, when people said, all the drug dealers should go to jail, the jails then got overwhelmed. And so people started building more and more jails in small towns and in Chicago, in different neighborhoods, etc. And they were filled. then they were, so how to deal with not enough jails gets to your small town question. We're now in the opposite situation. That is, especially the big city jails no longer are so full because of these kinds of policies nationally. However, not in Chicago. In the last 2 years or so in Chicago, there's been a dramatic increase in crime. And why that has happened, nobody really knows. That is, I've heard presentations by the top experts in Chicago, the police, the criminal people, criminologists, sociologists, and so forth. And we can list 15 factors that might be going on, but to try to analyze and to control which of those 15, how do they fit together, how much, and why is Chicago so different from New York and LA, we just don't know. So, yeah.
And I guess for Chicago in particular, like, has this increase has been like the last 10 years?
No,
just
about 2 years.
Just about 2 years.
Yeah, crime was going down in Chicago until the last, maybe 2 or 3 years.
Okay. Yeah.
So I mean, I've had a number of students very interested in this. There've been a couple of South Side students who've had family connections with gangs, and the big stories. I mean, well, the obvious thing, especially for our Chinese, that is many international visitors here, especially people from Asia, say, oh, crime. Are you going to the U.S.? Going to Chicago? You know, you're going to die. All right, so your mother probably calls you up. Are you still alive? And so forth. All right. So I've lived in Bronzeville, and if you look on the map of Chicago historical crimes and murders and deaths for the last 100 years, I live at the center of crime. I go biking at night all over Chicago in all the neighborhoods. I mean, I look at the data and I say, hey, here are the high crime places. I've been biking there for 10 years. Let me go down with my video. So I take my video, and I stand there for 45 minutes, midnight, 10 p.m., 3 a.m., and I take a video and see what's going on at this. Is this, you know, what's so different about this street? And often they don't look very different. But what I then have noticed is how often are the police cars coming by? So the police release these data. Yes, one more little story, and this is right on something that we wanted to talk about. The normal story of crime in Chicago is that the high crime areas are West Side and South Side. Okay, how do you interpret that? It's a political question. So people will say it's black. People will say it's poor. People will say it's dangerous. People will say it's single-family mothers with sons who don't respect their parents and don't go to church. I mean, you can name 15 things, but what this ignores is the unit. And the last time we talked, not Monday, but last Wednesday, we talked about how big is the unit, and are we talking nationally like all of China, or regions in China, or smaller units? And this whole story changes if we stop using these neighborhood, that is these community areas they're called in Chicago, and instead go to points. So if instead you look at points and you say, where is crime? Then the story becomes, there's an elevated railroad. And these show very, very high crimes at the stops of the L. And this was the highest. This was King Drive and
it's 63rd. It's on 63rd where the King Drive stop is.
Okay, 63rd. That's yeah. Okay. So that's where I spent an hour. You know, I went there multiple times with my camera. That was the highest place on the south side. Okay, so this was 10 years earlier, then 10 years later. So 10 years earlier, this was bright red stuff, I mean very high crimes. After 10 years, many of these disappeared. What happened during those 10 years?
We lost 10 years.
During the 10 years where those L stops became safer.
Yeah, they become renovated with cameras. Right, like overall.
Well, probably a little bit of that, but most of all, the police knew this, so the police went there, and they began patrolling those immediate areas, and crime went way down. Here it went down, but it was still very high. Okay, point one. Point two, I live over here in Bronzeville. What's the crime rate? Say this is King Drive. Actually, I live right on King Drive. What's the crime rate on King Drive in Bronzeville compared to the Loop or Lincoln Park, Wicker Park, rest of Chicago, or let's say Cambridge, Berkeley, Westwood area of LA? About the same. That is, I live in Bronzeville, and in my immediate neighborhood, the point is there are big differences if you go 1 or 2 blocks. And so different blocks have very different experiences. I won't say broken windows is too simple, but they're different scenes. So the scene idea came in part from my biking all around the city, for years. I've done this for decades. And you get a sense of how people act and treat one another differently in different scenes. But that the scene is smaller, the scene is not the whole West Side. That is, if you say the West Side and the South Side, the story that conveys is race and poverty. Race and poverty are the causes of crime. What's the story here? This whole area is 100% black, or 99.9% black. So it's not race, it's not poverty. It's the L stops. It's the specifics which can be, where policy interventions can make a dramatic difference and have done so with cameras, with police patrols, with people, with lighting, brighter lighting, and so forth. So you've only been here, most of you only been here briefly, but this campus was about 1/4 as bright as it is now 5 or 10 years ago. It was dark. Crossing the Midway was dark, and people were scared to cross the Midway. Now, it's like Times Square. We got lights everywhere. And I haven't seen specific crime data, but I bet that the crimes, at least the concern of crossing the Midway, walking around in Hyde Park, have dropped substantially. Richard Taub did a famous book on fear of crime and actual crime rates in Chicago and Chicago neighborhoods. And the dramatic finding was, if you compare Hyde Park to the Loop to a bunch of other, Hyde Park was off the charts. Everybody, oh my God, Hyde Park is terribly dangerous. Fear of crime is over the top here. You look at the actual crime rates, and they're about the same, as I said, as New Haven, Berkeley, Lincoln Park, Cambridge, and so forth. So each of these, so you get very different stories depending how you look at the data, and all of these are valid. So I'd say everything you said is good. They're all good topics. You can pursue any one of them, but do them enough that you get a sense how the simple race, class, gender causes everything.
Yeah. And Vargas talks about gerrymandering in his book with the east side of Little Village and stuff. Yeah.
What Vargas does, which is a brilliant innovation, is to bring in the political and civic activities into the two halves of Little Village. It's the one of the most important Mexican-American neighborhoods in Chicago. And because it's the same basic neighborhood, it shares ethnicity, it shares income, shares education, it shares the general social characteristics, but dramatically different stories in terms of crime rates, and these in turn are embedded in one strong, tough alderman who has civic activities working together and low crime, and the other is fragmented among different aldermen, and no one really pays attention. The civic groups don't get funded. They don't intervene where the police to try to help the gangs cut back, and the gangs are going wild, and the gangs are actively killing off each other, and they're very heavily involved with international drug stuff. So two very different stories in the same neighborhood, and so these are. And so I mean, if you've read some of Vargas's work, you know that Vargas does what I'm telling. What Vargas does is what we're doing here. Go beyond the simple stereotypes, which is to say, oh yes, if people are poor and black, they're going to be dangerous. Not true. But if we look at, especially in this course, if we try to look at policies that make a difference, and so, I mean, Sophie, you mentioned a couple of things in Bronzeville. Anything you want to add to this, say housing or any other specific policies in Chicago or elsewhere that relate to this?
Is it that you're interested in drug crimes specifically?
I was curious about like how the economies of like an urban area versus like a rural area kind of influence their desire for jails, and that to like try to bring in either new jobs or some new industry, and then how that sort of results. So like.
Okay, but I mean, here's a good general point. How strong is the relationship between rural income and support for more stringent crime policies? That is, if we look at the relationship between those two measures, that is, okay, is the question clear?
Yeah. I like with particularly like John Eason's book is like partly like kind of the inspiration. He did like Big House on the Prairie.
Okay, I mean, I haven't read the book, but what kind of evidence does he offer that would answer my question?
He went to Forest City in Arkansas because they're a city that economically suffering and, you know, wanted to bring in a jail. And one thing that was really interesting about it was it even went beyond even typical like political or demographic interests. Like you had the white supremacists are loud with racists in the town that. Okay, wait, just a second. I mean, clearly lots is going on in one tab, but let's try to answer this. Does he address my simple question? How clearly, how strong is the relationship? That is, if people live in a small town and they're poor, how much that is, and if you take, I mean, if the people are more, or if you have everybody in all towns in the U.S., from big to small, and they vary in income, and they vary in education, and they vary in city size, how much is income and small city size going to predict stringency of crime? Well, I know that in this town, like at least in the prison, the prisoners don't even necessarily come from the area. Like a lot of them do come from more urban cities.
You're not answering the question.
So the part of it is that does crime even really matter in these cities when you're looking at whether they want a prison?
Are you asking about?
No, but you're avoiding my basic question. I want to get a clear answer to my simple, clear question.
Are you asking about not whether or not the economy of the town is going to bring a prison in, but more like does the demographic of the town like directly influence the crime in the town? Is that what you're asking about?
No. Let me ask it again. If you ask people, are you in favor of being more stringent, less stringent, or about the same in how we treat criminals? You ask that nationally or internationally. That's a stringency attitude. Okay, if we have that as a dependent variable, what causes some people to be more stringent and others to be less stringent? And how strongly can we predict that from knowing the income or the education or the race of the individual or the gender of the individual? You heard me say this before in this class? Something like this? What's the answer from what you've heard me say at least 3 times about other things? How strongly are these related?
At least in the book he says
No. What have I said here? That is, I mean, from what you've said of the book, he doesn't have a research design that permits him to answer my question.
Yeah.
Okay, so that is, you need a different research. But I mean, the simple answer is, try to remember how much does educate. I mean, because you get in many of your readings in the national media and in other courses, how much do race, class, gender, and national origin, like being Polish or Jewish or Irish or whatever, how much do these 4 classic social variables explain most attitudes and behavior, such as going to church, shopping, fear of crime, support of stringency in crime, and the answer is, anybody remember now which I've given you before? About 15%. That is, these four things explain about 15% in the variation in what people feel. What's the corollary of that? 85% is not explained by income or race or education or national origin or gender, which is to say there are many women who are, that is, women who may be a little more worried about crime, but to know that someone is a woman, to know that someone is black or white, to know that someone is a college graduate or not, to know that someone is Polish or Jewish, only lets you explain about 15% of the variation in being more stringent. So in that sense, they're small towns that are poor, that have low or high educated folks, and some of them will say we want to be tougher on crime. Others will say we don't want to be tough on crime, and many will be about the same as big towns and not very different.
Does saying you're tough on crime equate to wanting a prison?
No, that's I mean that is what would this suggest? Do you want a prison? Do you support a prison? And the answer is probably less than 15%. Or let's say it might be as high as 15%.
Well, at least in the point that he makes in the book, like he I think agrees in that like those factors don't determine necessarily people's views, but as a because it has both double and like it'll have the NAACP members and leaders in the community will join along with white supremacists in supporting the bringing of a prison. Like it seems like a very there's not much having to do even with beliefs or politics. Like it really comes from like this, I guess, need to survive economic.
No, but it comes from you're saying, and what you're saying may well be 100% correct. I haven't read the book, but if it says the NAACP supports it, and so that implies many citizens and many civic groups in the town want the prison. That's the general point.
Yeah, even though a lot of them.
Okay, but if you did a survey of all the citizens in the town, are you likely to find that 100% of the citizens want the prison? No.
Yeah.
Even if you have say 100 civic groups and 95 of the civic groups say we want it. And what happened in Proposition 13 in California? With the governor, Jerry Brown, all the civic groups, the Democratic and Republican Party, they all said, don't vote for Prop 13. And what did the citizens do? 2/3 of them said, cut taxes by half. The hell with you civic groups, the hell with you parties. So the citizens are not the same as the leaders, and they're not the same as the civic group. So it's not as if any of this is right or wrong, but you as analysts should be conscious of each of these as different sources of information. And if you're advising a city council member or the NAACP in that town or whatever, clearly it's good to be conscious of these. That's all, and to point these things out, and to not say everybody wants this, and certainly that is, I'd say one major thing that I've learned from not only living but also serving on boards and advisory consultants and so forth of civic groups and the series of aldermen in the ward where I live, is there's great diversity among the citizens in different subgroups and neighborhoods within Bronzeville. And you have, for instance, some older women active in churches who say we should abolish all liquor sales and consumption in the neighborhood. And there's parts of South Shore have done this. That is, we have dry neighborhoods in Chicago. No liquor may be sold. There are other people who say, we ought to be able to do anything. I mean, that's fascist. I mean, so you've got great diversity. And so when you get up to the aldermanic or the civic groups level, they're a little more consistent. But be cautious about attributing too much of a consistent view is all that I'm suggesting, or especially to say, I mean, that there's an economic self-interest. I mean, we have the same discussion in Bronzeville. Should we have a casino? And some of the people in the finance department in city of Chicago say, you know, yeah, if you have a casino in Bronzeville, that'll generate a lot of revenue for the taxes for the aldermen and for the city of Chicago. And the city of Chicago is in bad financial shape. The state of Illinois is a disaster right now. The schools are on the verge of being closed, etc. And so, casino would be great. What do the citizens all say when we have meetings on this? No casino! We don't want the gangsters. We don't want drug people coming into this neighborhood. It will transform the whole image of the neighborhood. No. So in that sense, there are people pulling and tugging always, and the world is gray. That's my simple story. But to try to understand where and why and how the different groups may shift is what we're trying to point out. Okay, backing up. I mean, I would say if you simply pull some of these kinds of things together in a paper, focusing, if you want, on the general point you're making is that some smaller towns have done this, and they may have had support from the NAACP and perhaps a majority of African Americans. Is in that sense, it contradicts the New York Times image that, you know, being tough is only a white elite and that blacks are against being tough. No, I mean, they're probably more. I mean, you have to look at the data. It depends on how you ask the question, but there are many African Americans who are tougher on crime and who want to be and are in their own lives tougher on criminals and crime than are especially whites in Hyde Park, for instance. Okay. I mean, so I'd say digging into any one of those general points that you've made, thinking about them yourself, looking at the kinds of evidence which we've just put up here, and there's a lot more. And reading critically the book, I mean, reading, you know, making the points that he does, but also thinking about yourself, what do other things say about it? All of those are great to do for a paper. Any specific follow-up of?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, you had your hand up.
Yeah. My question
Tell us your name.
My name is Rachel.
Okay.
I'm going to do a BA proposal because I think my question doesn't
Great.
have enough research.
Great.
And it's similar in some ways. I'm interested in what pushes people to give and where they choose. What pushes people to give,
yeah.
And more specifically, where people choose to give their money.
Okay.
So I've kind of made an assumption that people give either in terms of local giving, to either local political campaigns or to local nonprofits. And I'm also kind of considering religious institutions and where those might fit in. But I'm wondering what.
So when you say assumption, you're assuming that they don't give to religious institutions?
No.
That is, I'm teasing you a little bit and making a point for others, because many people will say, I assume. Is it necessary to say, as you did there, I assume? Can't you say, I may choose to focus on
That's fair.
civic and political groups, and I may not, but okay, fine.
And so I'm kind of questioning where people choose to put their money and how that's impacted by like who they are as people. So I'm from Tampa, and I picked to focus on Tampa because it's neither red nor blue, and so I think I'll be able to talk to people on, you know, who are both Republican and Democrat, but also who are represented by people who are both Republican and Democrat, and be able to make some assumptions about the state of the national government and how that affects where people give their money and also their own political background, and kind of question how that impacts city ordinance and like how cities move by who gets the money.
What data can you use?
I'm going to interview people from Tampa.
How many can you interview?
As many as I would like to.
Okay. Are there surveys of citizens in Tampa or nationally or any other where that you or elsewhere that you've looked at or might look at?
Not that I know of, no.
Have you looked?
No. But I figured that that's like a very niche subject that, you know, not many people are like interested in researching in Tampa, so I figured. And I don't have to do Tampa, I just know people there, and I know that it's, you know, if I interview people in Chicago, it would be very, first of all, it's run by Democrats, and second of all, most people here are Democrat. So I think that I was trying to go like kind of quote unquote neutral by finding a city that is both, you know, not necessarily one way leaning.
But just for everyone, if you're trying to see how strong is the relationship between, let's add another variable here. How strongly does the party, the political party, explain, say, cash contributions, and how much do each of these other things explain cash contributions? And you're interested in this either in the U.S. or internationally. Is the best way to answer that question to interview 5 or 50 or 500, and you probably can't interview 500 people. So it's more likely to be less than 100 in one city. And how are you going to sample? I mean, will they be? Is it a representative sample, or what if people don't answer? I mean, they don't answer. Or if you stop in downtown, you interview who's ever there, then they're not representative of people who are at home and so forth. So that is the point I'm making is think about your analytical questions. Then ask yourself, what research design should I use that will help me answer the questions that I'm interested in? And if the question as you framed it is, how much does political party affiliation, and therefore you're saying, I don't want to study Chicago, I want to study Tampa because political party, well, okay. That is, how much does the fact that Chicago is more Democrat or Tampa is more mixed shift this, or friends or whatever? That is, the bottom line here is likely to be about the same, 15%. Or put differently, interviewing a handful of people may be good for you to get a feel for how they talk about it personally, but it probably is not going to convince a lot of critical social scientists that this is new original evidence when these things have been studied in hundreds of surveys, hundreds of times in the last 50 plus years. This is mainstream political science literature. Stanford University, but for instance, if you want to take a look, there's a research center at Stanford University that's got data on cash, on who contributes to what kinds of civic organizations and political organizations, including political parties as a National Democratic Party, local candidates, mayors, governors, U.S. congressmen, U.S. senators. They've got not only, and they publicly list the name of each person who wrote the check. That's now publicly required to be disclosed. So you can look up you can look up and see, George Soros is a multimillionaire. He was the largest contributor to Obama. You can look up the name of maybe there's a limit such as $100 or something like that. Maybe it doesn't go below $100. But you've got all of the medium-sized, middle, and big contributors in the whole U.S. to all of these places. And you could, for instance, you could do that, and you can look at this for one little neighborhood within Tampa, and then another neighborhood in Tampa, and then look at it for Chicago if you want. Okay. And so in that sense, you might find that illuminating. That is, if you go to Tampa or Chicago and you say, could you tell me how many checks you wrote to which political candidates? Do you think people are going to tell you?
I don't know.
They might, but we don't know if they would exaggerate a little bit. Whereas if they've got to report this to the IRS or that is not just they, but that the people who got the checks are required to report who gave you the money, and they'll go to jail if they don't do it properly. You're more likely to have the actual numbers of checks, the actual right amount, than if you just stop people in front of the Art Institute, say on Michigan Avenue in Chicago, say, have you written any checks to political leaders recently? Not that I want to talk to you about. Okay, so there are many, many good topics you can write about, but if I hear you say something as you just did, I'm avoiding Chicago because it's more democratic. Do you think if you look at the data for people, say like Donald Trump, and how many people in Chicago wrote checks for Donald Trump, you think you might find a few?
Yeah.
Okay. Whatever the party of the mayor is in Chicago, whatever the state of Illinois is about, individuals can still write checks.
Yeah, I was just looking more at local politics, which I think might be a little different than national politics, but I'm not sure.
Sure, no, of course it'd be different. But all I'm saying is just being conscious of these and seeing how these rules of the game shift, and seeing that and being conscious of the fact that these kinds of different data are available will lead you away from the kind of simple black people are poor and they cause more crimes. That's the kind of thing I'm trying to get you away from. As a proud Bronzeville resident. Okay? And that one, when I've shown that one map, or these two maps, first of the neighborhoods, because this is the old Chicago tradition, making ecological maps and saying, oh, this is how cities work. And Chicago sociologists have done this for 100 years or something, almost 100 years. And you then get this map, which comes right from the Chicago Police Department, because we got big data. See, this is now hundreds of thousands of crimes. We didn't have this, and it would have been too hard to get this without lots of stuff being, all these little points. So more data leads you to recognize you need better theory and a sharper theory to say, how do I want to analyze the data, and what's the specific question that I want to try to answer? Okay. Anything you want to follow up? That is what I rather than trying to say, how about this? Why don't you write a paper? Why not think about these issues and think about how you might reformulate then we can email, we can talk about it again in class or whatever. Okay. Anybody else have a paper idea they want to discuss a little bit? Yes.
Actually, I just had a quick question. In the paper, let's say if we were going to do, so let's say if I ended up maybe focusing more on like the idea of the factors that could influence crime besides like race and all the and income and stuff like that, would I be able to include like maps or things that I've created?
Sure.
Kind of isolated?
Sure. No,
Okay.
sure. No, I'd say, you've heard me sort of say, I'm eclectic in terms of, I try to use all kinds of data, consider all kinds of theories, and then join them together to see what's compelling, what works. And then deliberate, and we have done this, and I've worked with people for decades, where we have conferences. So we have people. I've coordinated this project called Fiscal Austerity and Urban Innovation. We have over 10,000 cities. We have hundreds of people. We meet many times a year at conferences, so people know each other. We're strict on having comparable data. So we have the same data for France and for Spain, for Argentina, for Texas, and so forth. But we're completely open in terms of theory and ideology. So we have people who are strong Marxists. We have people who are, Milton Friedmanites. We have people who are uninterested in politics, who don't care personally, but who want to study the role upon. So we have people who are say the strong state is what you need to solve the problem. Other people say no, the state is too big. We need a small. So we've got people who disagree. So we then say, okay, let's analyze it. So the kind of conversation that we're having right now with the two of you, we've had with each other for decades. And so we try to say, so as we listen to one another, and I get criticized just as much as everybody else. What if we did this instead? And then said, no, I don't think that'll work. But then, no, I'll do it. So then we meet again 3 months later, and someone says, hey, I reanalyzed it the way I said you should do it, and I've shown you wrong. So that's happened again and again. Marty Lipset and I published a paper called "Our Social Class is Dying," which implicitly is one thing here, one question there. How strongly does social class explain voting or anything else? And so we had 10 years of debates. We had dozens of conferences. We had lots of people who were writing, publishing. We had over 100 papers, 4 or 5 books going on in this exchange. At the end of 10 years, we pulled it all together, and what's beautiful was many of the people changed their views, including me. That is, as we learn, you know, if someone does a new paper and they say, hey, it's you know, like this, I mean, this kind of thing. This is a completely new paradigm as to how crime works. So you see that kind of thing happening as smart people start working on these things and exchanging ideas with each other. It's wonderful. And so people change their views as we learn more. And so that's what I'm hoping to engender a little bit of here, that you can see how this happens, and don't trust your, you know, your instincts, or or what you read. Especially don't trust what you read or hear in the normal talk shows or media. I mean, you've seen enough to know that you got all kinds of attitudes, views, interpretations going on in the media all the time. And how can we as social scientists do more than just argue? Okay. Anybody else have something they want to ask? Okay, let's talk about some of the specific cases on the reading list. I want to go through some of them and point out some big points here. This is now part 4, section on contrasting types of cities and leadership patterns. Barbara Furman, Challenging the Growth Machine. This is a very nice study. She was teaching at IIT. She came from Pennsylvania, and she'd worked a bit in Pittsburgh. So in the book she contrasts 2 cities. It's a beautiful comparison of just 2 cities, but shows how you can address much bigger issues powerfully with just 2 cities. Okay. The simple point is, anybody looked at it? You want to talk about it a little bit, or am I the only one? All right.
I just had a comment that reading it was interesting. So I'm from Pittsburgh.
Okay.
And so it was an interesting kind of comparison to what my experience was.
Okay. Well, you want to tell us a little bit about the main points? And if it surprised you, all the better.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think Pittsburgh's model of development following the collapse of the steel mills is unique compared to other cities that experienced a similar collapse. They were surprisingly able to recover, not rapidly, but effectively, and have completely transformed the city to rely on new forms of industry, particularly healthcare and technology.
Okay. Great. I mean, that's a bigger, longer term thing. That's not her main point here. What does she say in the book? Or did you read it closely enough to see that?
I might need to remind myself. I read it accidentally last week instead of
Okay. Okay. Her big point is, for instance, and so let me ask it this way: Do we have declining steel mills in Chicago? Yes. Pittsburgh and Chicago were the 2 leading steel producing, Pittsburgh, Chicago, and Gary, Indiana. Gary, Hammond, and South Chicago along there. These are the 2 largest steel production cities in the whole U.S. So in that sense, Pittsburgh and Chicago, in that narrow economic sense, have some. But in Pittsburgh, is the point, the way she frames it. People might talk about, say, there are declining steel mills in this neighborhood. What might we do to try to have a policy about either land use or better transit or retraining? That is, you could have 2 or 3 specific policies that might be raised to address the problem. And in Pittsburgh, she suggests, in general, people would keep talking about, say, training programs, and that might go to a committee that dealt with education or job training programs and so forth. It might deal with crime a little bit, but that is, the issue would be discussed in terms of that issue. If you deal with, say, lead or cleaning up the environment, you'd have green groups, you have committees in the city council, you'd have hearings that dealt with it in those terms. Okay, Pittsburgh. In Chicago, if you had the same issues raised, how would they be transformed or discussed? Her general point is that often, and this is more the traditional older Chicago model, but it still recurs in some issues some of the time with even Rahm Emanuel. Many of those specific issues get rebranded as race and power. So it doesn't matter if you start with job training or crime or whatever. It soon becomes, it's black versus white, it's rich versus poor, and it's you're the bad person and I'm the good person, and who has the power to deal with it. And so, you know, so-and-so's mayor is corrupt, he's taking bribes, he's doing the wrong thing, I'm against him. Or we're trying to follow reasonable policies, our websites are showing the progress we're making in terms of job training. So that is the political cultures of the two cities are drastically different. One. Two, so she says, how can this happen? Answer one is political culture. Answer two is issue specificity, that is, be conscious of how different issues may shift, but how the dynamics of an issue is treated, such as I contrasted job training in the two cities, varies with the political culture of the city more generally. Then third, there are different resources which may come involved. So, and she gets into it a little bit, but I mean but we can join this with a famous paper by Mario Small when he was here, because Chicago is the most studied city in the world. I came to Chicago from New York because I wanted to study urban things. And New York, even though it's a bigger city and so forth, it had, 1/10 the amount of serious research that you find in Chicago. I mean, Chicago is, people come to Chicago from Norway, from Hong Kong, because we have studied Chicago. People, not me, but economists, geographers, sociologists, political scientists have studied this city again and again and again. And there's a massive amount of literature. So people come here to study these issues. Okay, so Mario Small did a paper and he said, is Chicago an average city and therefore a representative city in some way? And the bottom line is absolutely not. That is, the beauty of this city is it's not an out. So it's not representative. It's an outlier. It's an extreme case of lots of stuff. So the point, a more general point I'm making here is, if you're studying something like, say, the impact of income or race or a whole bunch of other stuff, you can have a scatter plot, say, of how cities or neighborhoods are located on these. Then, if you have something like a regression line for the whole U.S. or say all of Chicago or all of New York, you can say, is this one neighborhood down here or up here? Or you can also say, is it over here? That is it way off of the regression line? Is it a deviant? And the point is, Chicago is often way off the regression lines from the whole U.S. That is, Chicago is not representative. This is not Middletown. And, or put differently, we could probably say there is no Middletown. That is, it's fallacious to try to say any place is representative. That is, put differently, we can learn more by seeing great diversity by neighborhood, by cities, by countries, and then putting them together and comparing them. And so so for instance, I mean, the idea of having a very poor town, enough so that the NAACP says, yes, we're in favor of a prison, is probably a dramatic outlier compared to most other cities and most other local NAACPs. Okay. This is an African American National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It's an NAACP. Okay, so quick general point. Try to locate the individual cases on something like a scatter plot of the whole U.S. or the whole world. But then second, use the individual case to, if it's that is, for instance, in the case that you cited a case study. I mean, to know that that this was not a place where, say, blacks were opposed to it. What you're saying is, at least, now maybe some black citizens were opposed to it. But the interesting point is the NAACP favored the prison. Says that I mean, if that says that the culture, at least, and probably the end of the local NAACP talked to its at least its leading black active citizens, and they then came to the conclusion that we feel this is a good thing to support. That says the town is an outlier. But we can understand general processes better by including outliers in that sort of analysis. Okay, so in that sense, Barbara Furman chose two outliers, you might think. On the other hand, they're not, I mean, if you look at the national patterns, both of them have a fair number of low-income people. They have traditional industries. They're both big steel. They both also had big political machines. They had lots of ethnic and racial conflicts, but they resolved them in different sorts of ways. Okay, so I'm making a couple of different points there. And this is the one most cited. This is the only paper with a reading with a star in this section. So anything else on Barbara Furman, because it's so nice, and because I'm also using it as we are with the study you're mentioning. What's the name of the author again?
John Easton. He got his PhD here.
E-A-S-O-N?
Yeah.
Not T, not Easton, not Easton. E-A-S-O-N, John Easton. Okay, good. I'm illustrating the point that we can learn from good case studies as well as from citizen studies, as well as from mayor studies, and all of these are valuable for understanding urban processes. And if you use only one data source, you get a biased view. So try to check yourself by using, at least reading. I mean, there's not time. You can't do all of these things originally. But if you say, can I read someone who might have looked for a crime by point rather than by ward, and then you can get a different story. Okay. Anyone else have any questions, comments on Furman? Okay. All right. Let's just go through some of the others for big points. Steve Elkin, City and Regime in the American Republic. This is on changes in Dallas business and reform government. Okay. I'd say that some of the Texas cities are dramatic outliers in the U.S. The one thing that Elkin points out, and there's also a study by Robert Lineberry on San Antonio. There's several other Texas cities that have been studied. One dramatic thing which they illustrate in terms of the big debate of business leadership and capitalism. That is, how much does capitalism lead to stronger businesses locally, and how much does having stronger businesses change the local political dynamics? Does it lead to having more conservative or distinctive policies in the city council? Okay, so Hunter's basic story for Atlanta was, yes, capitalism drives businesses to be more powerful, and so the business elite follows, drives the political decisions. And Clarence Stone made the same point. This is the main theme in our leadership section of the very first part of the course. And you turn on many of the media, and they still tell you this clearly. This is a fact. Okay, Hunter then was challenged by Dahl. Okay. And you know that general story. The next phase, however, was that these two case studies of Dallas versus New Haven can be compared. That is, we can try to compare them and say, is the researcher telling us something that's in his personal head? Is it his ideology that he's going around and finding people who tell him a business leadership story or a political issue, or are the cities themselves actually different? The better way to do that, or to answer that question, is to try to use comparable methods. And so we had, remember I put up on the board the traditional elitists, like the Italians, and then we had Dahl, Hunter, and then the comparative researchers. So the comparative researchers would go to Dallas, would go to New Haven, would go to Chicago and ask the same questions of the same kinds of informants, like the mayor, the head of the city editorial newspaper staff, and so forth, a Chamber of Commerce business leadership group. And then you can say how much is the city and how much is it the method, and the answer is you get much more powerful results if you ask directly comparable questions. And so, point one. Point two, nevertheless, it also emerged clearly that some Texas cities had very strong business leadership, much more than, say, New Haven and places like New Haven. And so having some case studies of these strong business leadership cities shows, just as Chicago is an outlier, how business leadership did work in Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio in the past. What you had in several of them, detailed here, for instance, is the business leadership would create a fund, money. They put in millions of dollars and say, this money is to fund the city council members of the city. Then they would say explicitly, we, the business leadership, we like these 5 city council members. We're going to give you $5 million. Here are 5 other council member candidates. We don't like you. We're not going to give you any money, or we're going to fund people to try to eliminate you from office. We want to beat you. That is, the business leadership was openly, explicitly, directly involved, taking positions publicly, funding candidates in ways that in most other cities in the U.S., this is considered absolutely bad business. Okay? So the point is, having these studied, as Elkin does, is great to see. And so you don't need to imagine what might happen if the business leadership is actually doing this, because you also can see in other places where, and you can find the numbers. So I'm addressing sort of a very hot ideological issue. What is the role of business leadership in capitalism, and so forth? And so there are many studies on this. And Elkin's personal position, as is the next one, Todd Swanstrom. Swanstrom, in a sense, is the opposite. In the sense that of choosing a non-Texas city, he chose Cleveland, and he chose the election of a populist, self-styled populist, poor-oriented two mayors, Kucinich and Voinovich. And Kucinich campaigned against the high cost of utilities. That is, the electric company was selling electricity to the citizens of Cleveland, and it was private, and the rates were going up and up and up. And people complain a lot in Chicago, for instance. It's an issue especially for low-income persons. He took a strong stand, and so he was elected. And he basically nationalized. That is, the city took over the electric company, and the city government provided electricity to the citizens thereafter. And he tried to lower the cost of electricity. They basically were subsidizing to some degree. Although he tried to say, we're taking away the profits. That they're stealing money from poor people. We want to get rid. So he made it a very ideological issue. After 2 or 3 years of this happening, a guy named Voinovich ran against him, who said, "This is bad management. You're raising taxes for all of the residents of Cleveland. You're driving away all kinds of taxpayers. You're subsidizing only electricity, and this is bad policy to subsidize just one thing in that way." And so he was elected mayor, and he beat the first guy. So seeing, that is, I'm contrasting the Texas cities with Swanstrom, and I'm making a more general point. Both of them are somewhat leftist political. I think they're both political scientists. they both are very critical of what they're writing about, and their ideology is very explicit. The nice thing is they each have some contrast. So we have two mayors in Cleveland. We have I didn't stress it, but there also are changes over time. That is, the patterns that I described were followed in Texas cities for only about 10 or 15 years. Before they did not do that, and afterward they did not do that. One that I followed particularly closely was Houston, and let's raise this because Houston illustrates. We got this one. We have a reading right on this. Let's use Rosdell. Don Rosdell has a book called "The Context of Radical Population in U.S. Cities." This is focused especially on only 4 or 5 cities in the whole U.S. that have the most radical populist mayors. And they were initially Santa Monica, and then a town in Vermont named Burlington. Who's from Burlington, Vermont? Anybody? Do you know? Who ran in the Democratic primary against Hillary Clinton? Bernie Sanders. Okay, where's Bernie Sanders from?
Burlington or Vermont.
Burlington, Vermont. I mean, I think he grew up in Brooklyn, came to the USC, went to the SSA. He was then mayor of Burlington, Vermont for many years, and he's included in detail as a major progressive left activist mayor. So there are 4 or 5 mayors in the country that really did this seriously for a number of years. So seeing how they did local politics and how different they were from others, again, makes this interesting because this is so different as were the Texas cities. So the point is, this is one of the beauties of studying policies in a local context, because when you go to the national level, everything is compromised. And you've got to find something that people will vote on. And whereas if you go to the local level, you can find an NAACP locally that will support building a prison. Nationally, you'd never find that. That's why it's interesting. And similarly, Rosdell's pointing out some of these dramatic differences. I'll just mention in passing that we have a book on Chicago that I've worked on. It's an oral history called Trees and Real Violins, Building Post-Industrial Chicago. We started it when Harold Washington was elected the first black mayor of Chicago in 1983-84. And I called up Bill Grimshaw, who was the campaign manager. Well, no, we'd had a couple of workshops here. We had candidates. We had Bill Grimshaw. We had Paul Green, who was the main policy advisor. Political. Could we maybe just close that door, please, because it's a little noisy here. Thanks very much. We had debates, and it was clear that it's near the end of class, and I misread that. Okay, we'll just end here and say it's available if you want to talk about it, but I've drawn on it in some of the examples that I've cited here. Then there's a paper I'll just point out as well. Barbara Furman, who we talked about first, co-authors the next paper with William Grimshaw, who was my collaborator because William Grimshaw and his wife Jackie were the campaign managers of Harold Washington. So they had connections, they had access to people that I never would have had. So when Harold Washington won the primary and then he won the general election, I called up Bill and I said, this is the most studied city in the world. This is a major historic event. People say the politics of Chicago are explained by the mayor and by the machine. Harold Washington has broken those rules. He's beaten the machine. This is major. You ought to do a book on it. He said, no, I'm too busy. I called him back a month later and I said, Bill, this is major. why don't you reconsider? And he said, well, I'll reconsider on one condition. I said, what's that? That you do it with me. He said, that's how I got involved. And so I tried to bring a bigger, broader interest in China and France and Yugoslavia, but also focus on Chicago. So as you can see, in some of the things that we're talking about. All right, we're at the end of the hour. We'll stop for now, but bring questions and let's continue on Monday. Yeah, we will not. I think it's now explicit in the syllabus. There is no class next Wednesday, the day before Thanksgiving.
Okay.
Yeah, that's. I think that's explicit now.
Because I sent out.